This video will cover some tips for you as you think about outlining your torts class. You'll hear a lot about outlining in law school, and I advocate it as a process that you consider using. So I think the best place to start is why we advocate outlining so much. Why should you outline? It takes a lot of time. You could go purchase outlines. There's students who've completed outlines who did well in law school, and you could just use theirs. Why do we focus so much on asking you to outline? And the answer is because the outline itself is not the most important thing. If it were, then all you should do is try and find the very best completed outline and just use that. The reason we advocate outlining so much is it's a great process to use, to go through, to determine where you have gaps in your understanding. What we mean by outlining is synthesizing the information from class into a structure of concepts that you can see where the concepts relate to each other, and then also that you can see the internal roadmap or structure of each individual concept. So the process of putting the information together is actually the most important aspect of outlining itself. That's why you can't just go purchase one and get the same thing out of it. Outlining is not a substitute for practicing actually writing out practice problems. In the end, ultimately, you can have gone through the process of outlining, truly understand the law that we're going through in class, and even know it really well. But if you are not putting time into practicing writing out exam answers, then your actual grade in the course will likely not be what you expect to get and not reflective of your actual understanding. So I say this because I want you to balance outlining and that function with the ultimate thing you need to do, which is putting pen to paper and writing out answers to questions. The outline, however, can really aid you in working through practice problems because you might find that when you start to attempt to write an answer to a question that you run into difficulty thinking through the concept. Going back and revisiting your outline will allow you to figure out where you have some misunderstanding or some deficiencies of understanding. Because the ultimate outline is not the most important thing, you may choose that for you a different format altogether would work better. So for example, you might want to consider flowcharts or other kinds of diagrams that work quite well for students. The outline is just sort of a classic example of process that people work through, but it certainly is not the most important or the most useful one for every student. So what is in an outline? I think that there are three main pieces to an outline. The first is the structure. It has two subparts. We'll get to that in a moment, but the structure, it needs to provide you some tool by which to see the relationship between concepts and also how concepts are constructed. The second thing that your outline needs to include are rule statements. On the day of the exam, you will be given a set of facts that you haven't seen before. You're not going to be able to find them out in the real world. You can't anticipate them truly. That's the unknown. That's the thing you can't control. But what you can control is clear rule statements, and you should, in your outline, practice writing out rule statements in full sentence form. I think it helps if you go through how you're going to articulate a rule statement on the exam. I often refer to these things as canned rule statements. You have a lot of control over these. The rules I will not change, even if for some reason tort law should change significantly between the time we end class and the time you take the exam. I will hold the rules as they are at the end of class, and that's what I'm going to test you on. So if you have these already written out, you won't have to expend the mental energy it takes to think about drafting a rule statement during the actual exam itself. You should put that sweat equity in now. Be clear on what you're going to state, and that way when you get to the exam, you can just spit these out and you don't have to spend time thinking about how to state rules. The third important thing a outline should provide you is some tools to practice applying the rules to fact patterns. And so I suggest that you might want to consider giving yourself issue spotting triggers. In other words, like little points of application. When I see these facts, I should consider using these rules. So where do you start outlining? Well, at a base level, it starts after each class, that you should be at this point synthesizing your notes from class. So after class, what I'd like you to do is try and summarize the content you learned. Pull out the rules of law, make sure you have clear rules now, clarify any that you didn't have accurately stated before class, and you might need to clarify that with others in your class or with me. You should also, at this point, be making a point of reflection on how your note-taking strategy is actually working. Are you finding yourself taking too many notes in class and actually missing out on the discussion? If you're in this camp, typically what it feels like is it's going too fast. You'll say to yourself, they state things too fast, I can't keep up. Oftentimes, then you're a student who's actually trying to jot down too many things on your paper and you're just missing the flow of class. Remember, law school, unlike a lot of other studies like an undergraduate or other graduate disciplines, we're focused more on getting a discussion of the rule and not lecture format. So sometimes you're still in that note-taking lecture format, and you want to make sure that you are switching your approach so that you're able to actually participate in the discussion, and then after conclusion of discussion on that topic has been had, you jot down a few notes that synthesize or put together what that discussion was about. You also might be in the total opposite end of the spectrum here, and you might be taking too few notes. In other words, you might be coming out of class and not actually getting rules from the class itself, or you might be missing hypotheticals so that you don't know how the rule should be applied. So if you find yourself synthesizing your notes after class and you don't have clear rule statements, or you don't know how a particular rule would be applied in a fact pattern, then you're probably not pulling as much as you should out of class. You also should reflect on whether you need to take more or less notes to help you stay engaged with the material during class. In addition to just making sure you have the appropriate amount of content, sometimes note-taking can either be distracting to you as an individual, or it may actually be something that helps you stay more focused in class if you find yourself focusing on other things. So you want to ask yourself that important question: am I doing things that help me stay appropriately engaged with class without being overly distracted? If you find yourself not hitting that appropriate balance, you may want to consider things like watching the recording after class so that you can focus more during class, or finding a tool that helps you stay more focused if you're trying to take more notes, by making sure that you maybe have pre-printed some notes before class and you're now focused on trying to fill those in. All right, so turning to the big outline now, you have been synthesizing your notes after class, you have a summary of rules. Then what your goal is in outlining is to find the structure of the law. So I see this as two main parts. The first is the big picture. And by this I mean you need to determine how each concept fits within your understanding of the overall course. So for example, in torts so far, we've covered a couple different torts and some defenses. By looking at the big structure, you should be able to identify distinctions between the torts that we've covered, and then commonalities. So right now, what's in common is they're all intentional torts. We're going to soon turn away from intentional torts and talk about negligence. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your outline those distinctions so that when you look at it, you can easily find, this is my section on intentional torts. I see the distinctions amongst each of them. I see what overlaps amongst each of them, and I can see how they fit differently from negligence, which we'll get to. Sometimes it's helpful to focus on the policy behind the rules in order to see these relationship between concepts. If you're struggling for where to find such structure, look to either your casebook, the table of contents, and then how each chapter is subdivided will provide you a lot of guidance. You can also look to the course syllabus, where I've structured this big picture right in your reading assignments. Okay, the other related concept to structure is roadmap. By this, what I mean is within each concept, so let's take some of the intentional torts we looked at, like battery. You should be able to have a clear roadmap of the issues that are considered within that tort. So for example, in battery, it would be each element. And then sometimes within the element, we had a lot of sub issues. Take the battery element of contact. There are a lot of sub elements related to what constitutes contact that is actionable in battery. As you're putting together your roadmap, you want to think about whether or not there's hierarchy to these issues. Does an issue need to be considered before another one, or can you take them in any order in an exam? What you're trying to do for yourself with a roadmap is set up how you would go about answering a question. So for example, if a question asks you about battery, your outline should have provided you with guidance of how you would walk through the discussion of that entire tort. Again, what you want to look to are the syllabus for some structure and your casebook. But in addition to those, you might look to your case briefs or your notes from class, where I try to provide a lot of structure, especially on our PowerPoint slides. In addition to structure, as I mentioned, one of the key functions your outline does is it makes sure you have got clear rule statements. And like I said, you really want to focus on making sure you have these pre-written before the exam. So do this now in your outline. Make sure your rule statements are written out in sentences. I think that's the most useful way to do it because you're going to need to write it in a sentence in the exam. Spend the time now focusing on how it's going to be written when you've got time and energy and you're not in the test taking conditions. Make sure your rule statements are precise and clear, and also make sure you have the sub-rules stated in your outline. These will be the rule part of your IRAC. I would also want to give you a suggestion that you should consider multiple versions of a rule. For example, we've covered both majority and minority approaches in torts, and you should know all of these. One other thing that should appear in your outline are the sample issue spotters, or what I'm going to refer to here as examples of application. So what you should do is try and determine whether or not your outline's working by applying the rules to different fact patterns. You might include some examples of these in your outline itself. So where might you find practice fact patterns? Well, you've got lots of them. There's hypos in your case book. I've provided some in class. Every case itself basically is a given fact pattern, and you have an answer from the court. I will be distributing several questions throughout the semester, which are example test questions. And after you look at all those things, then you might consider outside sources like old exams or commercial aids. But really, you have all you need from the class and from the casebook itself. I've found that sometimes students like to put a side column on the side of their outline with just small references to a hypo or to the facts of a case, so that it serves as a memory tool when they're thinking about those rules. What you don't want to have, however, is just a copy of your case brief or just strung together cases in your outline. Which gets us to our next topic. What is not an outline? An outline is not simply just copying every class note you've ever had into a file, or just taking all your case briefs and stringing them together. It's the synthesis of things you've learned from cases and things you've learned from the class, which is why just copying those things is not what you want to do. It's also not just getting someone else's outline, whether it be a commercial aid or another student's. Of course, these are helpful if you're looking for a guide to emulate, or if you want some suggestions, or to clarify even your own outline. But because, as I mentioned, the process is the most important part, simply having a copied outline is not good enough. There's also no prize for beauty in outlining. Sometimes students, I think, take great pride in doing very detailed, color-coded, multi-tabbed outlines, and for some students, that's the most helpful tool for them. But if you're the kind of student who doesn't think that way, don't worry, because at the end of the day, I'm not going to grade you on how nice your outline looks, or even if it's complete. What I'm going to grade you on is whether or not you can actually write an exam answer. And to the extent that your outline has helped you do that, then it's done its job. If you have a beautiful outline but you can't write an answer, it doesn't matter. An outline is also not something that you finish the day before the exam with no time to actually work on those exam answers and trying to write out your IRAC answers. Remember, your outline's most important job is to provide you with a tool to actually practice writing exam answers. If it's being done at the last minute, it doesn't do that. And it's just actually at that point in time better to focus on writing out exam answers than it is to finishing up your outline. My final tips for you relate to the question I get asked most about, which is when to outline. And there's really no great answer to this. You might find that for you, it's helpful to do it with set periods of time, that you might just set out a schedule and say every couple weeks I'm going to do my torts outline, and that on the off weeks you do your other class outlines. Another good tool is to finish a discrete unit. If you look in your syllabus, after each tort we finished, you could outline that tort. I mentioned to you to start the Brody problem that what you should do is outline battery since it's related to that concept. So you can kind of look at that. If you're in doubt as to whether or not we've finished a topic yet, you can always ask me and I'll tell you whether or not there's more to go within that topic. All right, so hopefully this has provided you some good tips to think about as you're outlining in your torts class. And as always, feel free to ask me any questions you might have.